Good morning and welcome back to AHA Insights and Solutions Fairgraham's webinar series. We're excited to have you join us for our second session where we're diving into a topic, navigating federal funding uncertainties for infrastructure projects, that's on a lot of minds right now. Funding seems to be a moving target, and with more changes coming, it's critical to stay ahead of the curve. Today, we'll explore what's happening in the federal funding landscape and how you can position your projects for success. Guiding us through this is someone who knows the ins and outs of funding like few others, Bridgette Stocks, Senior Community Development Specialist at Fehr. Bridgette is Fairgraham's go-to funding expert, turning challenges into opportunities for clients. She's been at this for nearly 2 decades and has helped secure more than $500 million in funding for infrastructure, environmental, and brownfield redevelopment projects. If there's a way to get a project funded, Bridgette will find it. She's here today to help us understand recent policy shifts, anticipate changes, and most importantly, keep projects moving forward. Before we get started, a quick note, we have muted everyone to minimize background noise, but we want to hear from you. Drop your questions in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will get to as many as possible during the session. All right, Bridgette, let's get started. They are all yours.
Okay, thank you, Emily, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. My goal is to provide as much clarity and information as we can possible for what is happening right now and things that are still happening as we're sitting here in this webinar, just to try to kind of give you clarity, answer your questions, and help you and your projects navigate our way through this process. So next slide, please. So how did we get here? I know it's going to seem crazy. It was only 11 days ago, although in some ways it already feels like 11 years ago, that the OMB memo was sent out on January 27th that set this federal funding freeze. So this is when everything started on January 27th. So why did this happen now? It is very typical for new administrations to definitely do agency reviews, look through their spending, maybe do a little temporary freeze on things that are happening, but something this far wide reaching that has very specific components that they're trying to work with is very untypical. So thus the chaos, right? When they froze every single thing with federal funding without a lot of direction. What they're looking for in all the funding agencies, the current administration, with the executive orders and their policies, they're looking for language or funding that is tying to immigration, foreign aid, environmental or Green New Deal issues, anything with energy policy, and items that have diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, as I'm sure you've heard, programs or funding tied to it. Next slide, please. So when they set this OMB pause on the 27th, the suspension temporarily applied to any new awards or obligation of federal funding, the disbursement of that funding, and then any activities for merit review panels. So if there's a new funding program that comes out, they set a NOFO, that we call it, a notice of funding opportunity. So there was a freeze on all of those so they could remove that language that we just kind of touched on in the previous slide. So when that initial funding freeze, these are the things that were supposed to be stopped in our sector of the world. And every agency, federal agency, was asked to identify all their programs, their funding that would be affected by the executive orders or had that specific language included. And they were supposed to submit changes or details to the current administration by February 10th. And then they would assign oversight responsibilities and make any modifications that they needed to make their federal funding still eligible based on the executive orders and the federal funding freeze language. So that was supposed to happen. That was the intent of the funding freeze on January 27th. Next slide, please. So obviously, when this happened, it was absolute chaos. There was a lot of confusion. Agencies didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing, what they were supposed to freeze, if they were supposed to stop work, if they were supposed to be losing staff. It was chaos. The main reason for the outrage, and just to be a little bit political nerdy on you. The main reason for the outrage initially is that constitutionally, only Congress has the power of the purse, right? They're the ones that hold all the money and distribute the funding. And the executive office or the presidency or administration does not have the power to impound that funding once it has been obligated legislatively. So there was an immediate rub between who controlled the money and what they were able to do constitutionally. Thus, why all the chaos happened and there's been so much legal action, so much outrage. So 2 days after they issued that order, they put a stop out rescinding the order. So the language for the rescission is right there. Does it mean that it's over? Absolutely not. The administration automatically said that it's just a rescindance of their OMB order from the 27th, but they still anticipate the federal funding freeze to be in place in specific to the language that they had included on the 27th. Next slide, please. So who and what is affected by this ongoing federal funding freeze? So any new awards or obligations that are not already under grant agreement, those are most certainly under review right now. If you have an existing award, some of the language might also be changed. So those are two things that are under review by the administration. The disbursement of funds for where you have an existing award may have been paused, may currently be under pause, or could be under pause in the future. I know that seems a little bit ambiguous, but things kind of change daily here. And then the merit review panels for the notice of funding opportunities. So this would be for any future grant funding or loan funding that would be available from the federal government. There are NOFOs that they put out for review that you use as a guidebook almost when you're submitting for funding application. Those are all under review as well to make sure that they are in compliance with the administration's wishes. So just for an example, we had a few clients that were submitting United States Department of Transportation funding. They were looking for a RAISE grant that was due on January 30th, which would have been last Thursday. And on January 24th, the whole NOFO or the guidebook was completely redone and changed. And a lot of the language and the scoring changed just to line up with the administration's current wishes or the following of their executive orders. So it happens fast. It may happen without us knowing it. If we didn't reprint the NOFO on January 24th as we did, we would not have noticed or seen it until we were submitting. So they also changed that program, the name of the program. It was Build and it changed to RAISE. So just a real-time example of things that are happening with the NOFO changes. Next slide, please. So potentially affected sectors for our public infrastructure and environmental phase of the world. Obviously, infrastructure and transportation projects, anything that is funded by the DOT, EPA, EDA, USDA that we commonly use for funding resources, those are certainly affected by this freeze. Environmental funding. EPA is probably one of the most targeted agencies, definitely under this funding freeze and the reviews that are happening. The Clean Water Act and the brownfields specifically that apply to us. The Clean Water Act is everything that funds your state revolving funds, all of those loans and grants, lead service line replacement, emerging contaminant types of things. The USDA, US EPA, Clean Water Act, and brownfields, both very much affected by this. The nonprofit and community programs that we work with for more community development type grants and specific projects that come through HUD, anything through EPA, the Department of the Interior, or the Department of Transportation, those are impacted. Everything that's going through the Department of Education right now for research or anything that we would have used that was very specific to a certain project that we happened to find kind of offhand for funding that came through the Department of Education, that's certainly on hold. Environmental initiatives, anything that relates to the Green New Deal, which would be anything with recycling, brownfields, as we mentioned previously, anything with climate change, solar, renewable energy, all of those programs right now are really kind of under major review and threat. And then anything that you had a project that was on the list for congressionally directed spending, we usually channel those projects through US EPA, HUD, or the Department of Transportation on our side of the world. Those are certainly targeted. In the first administration from 2017 to 2020 that this current administration had, they did not have congressionally directed spending projects available. Aside from EPA, brownfields, and the climate programs, I would say the congressionally directed spending are probably in the most danger of getting cut completely. Their fate kind of lays in the next budget being passed, which they've kicked down the road to March 14th. So we'll have more clarity when that budget process gets going. Next slide, please. So there's one thing to remember is while we work with a lot of funding that seems like it is administered or funded by the state, any state that you're in, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa for us, that state funding is technically being funneled through by the federal government. So if you have state administered federal funding, those programs are most certainly going to be affected by this federal funding freeze as well. Whether it's just an immediate review or a slowdown in disbursements or changing the guidelines and scoring completely, these programs will most certainly be affected. So if you work with the ITAP or the Recreational Trail Program, those are technically funded by the United States Department of Transportation. If you have a CDBG, either public infrastructure or housing grant with DCEO, those are technically funded by HUD. State revolving funds, which I touched on a little bit, those are funded by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. EPA does have some of their own state, IEPA has some of their own state funding involved in that, but there's a very significant portion of funding that comes from the United States EPA. Safe Routes to School grants is also technically federal funding. Any lead service line replacement funding has almost all been financed by the bipartisan infrastructure law, the BIL. It also mainly goes to the US EPA, so that is federal funding. I will tell you that we have been very serious about looking into what the future is for lead service line replacements. We've already, if you're here from the state of Illinois, we have been through quite a bit of chaos on our own with the state lead service line inventory, the replacement plan, the new lead and copper rule that was issued by US EPA in the prior administration in October actually. There's been a lot of chaos around that. I will tell you that I've been following the research on this and that the current administration is looking at this lead service line replacement and the new lead and copper rule right now with plans to have it rolled back. I do not know what that means. No details are out on that, but do know that that is a plan that they have in place. So just kind of a heads up for everyone on that side. If you use USDA water and wastewater rules or loans that are funded by USDA, that's obviously technically federal money. And then if you got any REAP grants, which would have been renewable energy through USDA for solar or new grain dryer, those things are under review. And then if you had either IEMA or hazard mitigation, that's technically funded by FEMA. If you're in the state of Illinois and you have a DCO capital grant or Rebuild Illinois funding or IDNR funding for parks or some of the trail funding, that is all state funding. So those will not be impacted at this time. And then tourism funding, which came out the past 3 rounds, I believe, with funding, that is also technically DCO tourism money is state money. So that is not under the federal threat here. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of legal challenges underway. If you've been following it, there was There's another stop from judges to put a stop on the federal funding freeze. There's restraining orders to put a stop on the federal funding freeze. Kind of is changing daily. So we're just kind of keeping track of that. The legal challenges will certainly continue. There have been some funding reimbursement program lockouts for our public infrastructure side of the world. It's more so on the community need side of it, not so much on our public infrastructure. If it has happened on our side, it's been very brief. Things have been reopened, or it was closed just out of confusion. They didn't know if they should or not. But again, as I believe that it's going to be an agency by agency review of this funding and their programs, just expect that that could be happening in the future. There are certainly staff dismissals happening. Hopefully we won't be as impacted. US EPA is probably the biggest target right now, as we mentioned. There is uncertainty about how long is this going to last? What are the legal challenges going to be pushing it? How long are we going to be going back and forth on this? It's just a daily adventure right now. And we have experienced some communication delays, not from the agencies that we work with about projects that are ongoing, but no one has really touched too much on the fact that they're going to be impacted by the federal funding freeze. They're not sure what they're supposed to say yet. If you remember, like I said, this was just 11 days ago. So there's not really a plan for moving forward quite yet. Next slide, please. So strategic response from us, what you can do. Number one, for sure, get organized. If you have funding agreements from federal agencies, including loan agreements, just make sure that you have them compiled and on hand, ready to go. If anything is going to change, I anticipate just some language will potentially be revised. For the SRF program in general, the bipartisan infrastructure law, this will apply to the state revolving fund. Brownfield's got a major injection of money. The bipartisan infrastructure law was signed in 2021, and it's only supposed to last for 5 years. So that funding is definitely going to be coming off of these programs, and they're not going to have as much money as they normally do. So be prepared for that to be happening as well. And again, this is evolving. We're going to keep track of it. I will make sure we're tracking it at Fairgram to be able to give you as much information as we possibly can as things are happening in real time. I will say, don't panic. It's hard not to, because again, this was just 11 days ago. Worried about our money. This is vital. Not everything that's being said, or even the executive orders that are being passed, can actually be applied. So we need to wait a few things out. It's some political theater, I guess, is a nice way to say that a little bit, even though it's directly impacting us and you and your projects. That's certainly what's taking place. I would prepare for delays. And that's going to come to, if you're looking for a project plan approval, you need permits, you need environmental sign-offs. Your grant agreement's taking a little bit to get through legal. Your funding reimbursement's taking long. Staff's being cut, rules are being cut, funding's being cut for all of these agencies. So you need to make sure that you're thinking about those delays that will be happening, and make sure that you stay engaged. So we would certainly be a trusted source of information. I would talk to your legislative staff, or your U.S. rep, your state or congressman or women for your state. This is federal, so you want to make sure that you're talking to your federal legislators as well. There's going to be a lot of news, a lot of information, but just make sure that it's coming from the trusted sources. Next slide, please. So just key takeaways that we know of right now, today. Any funding applications that are already approved can still proceed for now. We haven't been told of any work stoppages. There's been a few kind of splattered about, but again, we don't know if that's because they're under a review, they're having a staff change, or funding has actually been stopped. So delayed reviews could mean changes to your reimbursement or your application timelines, or application programs might not even open for a cycle or two while they're figuring out funding. So think about those things. Program-specific guidance by the agencies, we'll have information on the SRF, we'll get information on brownfields, everything about our projects moving forward we will get in the coming weeks, hopefully as soon as more final answers are settled. And expect major program changes. Like I said, the bipartisan infrastructure law is really going to impact the IEPA funding that we get, just the amount. Brownfields for sure, anything climate change, Green New Deal, green infrastructure, all of these things, I think, and the congressionally directed spending are probably the most in danger. So expect major program changes for that. And we can certainly help you. We're here to answer any questions that we possibly can, get as many detailed as we can, help you for all of your specific projects, or if we need to talk to a specific agency. And then also to help you kind of navigate the funding program changes as they come. We'll try to keep you as informed as we possibly can as things are happening in real time. Next slide, please. All right.
All right, well, thank you, Bridgette. That was quite informative. We do have one question in the chat right now, and I encourage anybody who has questions to add them to the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them during this session, but we'll start with Owen's question. Based on the executive orders from the White House, do you think the upcoming appropriations in mid-March will defund or significantly reduce federal pass-through funding?
Yes, and I think specifically for the agencies that we talked about, the bipartisan infrastructure law is in place for one more cycle technically. So we shouldn't see major changes to like your state revolving fund. Brownfields, if they're allowed to continue as normal, they do have an injection of that funding as well. But for the pass-through funding to the state agencies, I do think that we're going to start to see a drop-off of total funding available to them.
Okay. Here's a question that I have, Bridgette. How do you see this affecting smaller municipalities?
So in terms of our smaller municipalities, where we definitely rely on more funding opportunities to be available to them to be able to complete projects, things that we're able to complete, 1, 2, or 3 years may now be pushed out. I think if funding is not going to be as readily available or as abundantly available, things will start to be phased, or we're going to try to look for maybe some more advantageous routes of funding if there's local lending available or bonds that we need to start looking into, or TIF districts or business districts. There's just going to have to be a much more broad financial stack that we're going to have to look for our smaller communities.
Thank you. I have a question. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Shari Miller. She wants to know, do you have any resources that we can monitor to stay up to date on the most current information?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I have a great list of things that I constantly check almost every morning right when I start my workday, and we would be happy to share those for sure.
Wonderful. We have your email address, and Bridgette can follow up with you and to give you that list. I have another question for you, Bridgette. Will the requirement for MWDBE on federally funded projects be phased out? And that's coming from Lynn.
Yes, so that is the plan. So federal funding is women business, minority business, disadvantaged businesses, DBE, MBE, WMBE together, just to throw every letter at you all. That is definitely a federal initiative, and that is probably one of the first things that is going to be changed along with the language or requirements in these federal programs for the next 4 years, I would anticipate, yes. Now, we do have quite a few clients that have to work with BEP, which is also a business enterprise that we're looking for kind of the same thing as the federal, but that is state funded, and that is actually specific to the state of Illinois. So it's not going to have the same requirement if it gets shut down.
All right. I have another question for you. Have you ever seen anything like this happen before in your career?
So 2 things. When this administration came in 2017, there was a week-long shutdown of the state revolving loan funding program through USCPA, channeled through all of our state programs. That happened, but it was just a week while they reviewed things, and funding did not get affected. So there has never been anything this broad. I will say when Governor Rauner was in office in the state of Illinois, there was a stoppage on a lot of funding programs, and there was an actual stoppage of work. while projects were in mid-construction. So that's probably the only two things that I've seen, but never ever on this scale or this wide-reaching or threatening to pull funding, to push funding, and to change the scoring or the initiatives that are in place. No, never.
Okay. Ruth asked if we can share that resource with everyone, and we did say we can do that, and we can do that with our follow-up email after this webinar, which will also include a recording of this webinar. Ruth, Erin Murphy wants to know if it's okay for her to share this presentation with their federal congressmen so they're more aware of the local effect and concerns. What do you think, Bridgette?
Yeah, and hi, Erin, by the way. Erin in Hanover. Absolutely.
Wonderful. So Erin, there you go. We will, we definitely, please share this, and everybody else on this call, feel free. Carlos Molina has a question. You mentioned that federal ITEP is affected. What about federal funding managed by IDOT, such as all of these other more alphabet soup there, Bridgette, if you can see them, lots of them.
So IDOT has actually issued a bulletin, as they are wont to do. They've issued a very short bulletin so far that says they don't impact any of their other federally funded programs to be affected at this time, which is their caveat. So I believe they're just trying to do the same thing we are, kind of calm what's happening, try to figure out what they have going on with their funding. But so far, IDOT has issued that came from the boss there. That right now they don't believe that anything else federally funded will be impacting them. And in general, I'll just say too, the transportation projects and the public infrastructure projects, they're not meant to be like decimated, right? But the funding will change, the rules will change, the scoring is going to change. Some of the regulations that we have to follow, those are the things that are going to be changing. I don't think they're going to go away. I just think the amount of funding and the regulations that we have to follow will be different.
Wonderful. Now, Bridgette, I know one of your key points was not to panic. I imagine that, that people are trying not to panic. What's your best advice to not go that route?
Well, number one, to have a little bit of a plan in place, to put yourself in a place of knowledge, right? So everything that is federally funded, or if you need to ask us to help you determine what you have federally funded, to just know that you have a handle on that, and to see what you have in place and what we were planning for the future, and how those things will be changed and impacted. And then I would make sure you're having those conversations with your federal legislators that this is important. It directly and profoundly impacts your communities. And those are the channels that you need to be working, that will kind of they should have answers, hopefully, that will help you keep calm too. So the planning and to stay engaged are kind of the two things that I would recommend.
Great advice, Bridgette. We do not have any more questions at this time. And do you have any parting words for us, Bridgette?
I do, but Darren's here. He has a question. Can he ask a question?
Of course, Darren can ask a question.
I had a client text a question into me that couldn't do it, but they want to know, should our clients continue designing and moving forward on projects during this period, or should they halt all progress? People are concerned that they're getting ready, and or they don't know whether they should stop or continue the progress to get something shovel ready, or especially like SRF
Sure.
projects.
So that's a great question too. Should we continue with design? My advice would be yes on that. If you can, fiscally responsibly continue with design, assuming that, you might have to wait a little bit to get that funding reimbursed if you're looking for that. But I would say yes, if you absolutely can, in a fiscally responsible way, to continue that, because Darren just said the key words that we all kind of hated from the past decade is shovel ready, right? Like, I think that's what this is going to turn into. A lot of money will be missing, and they only want to work on projects that are going to be able to be completed, that are technically quote unquote shovel ready. So if you can, in a fiscally responsible way, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to turn this over to Emily.
All right, thank you, Bridget. It looks like we are out of time. If any more questions do come through, we will address those after, and you'll get a message directly from Bridget or from someone answering you. But on behalf of Bridget and Fairgram, I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. Our 2025 schedule is out and available on our website at fairgram.com, and we hope to see you at another webinar in the future.